All right, let's get started. It's just before 10 after, but I know I'm right before lunchtime, so hopefully I'll get all this in and get us out to lunch on time. Today we're going to be talking about WAI-ARIA and why I think it's awesome for everyone. Real quick about me, my name is Matt Long. I am a web developer at Cengage Learning. We have an office here in San Francisco, but I'm from the office in Farmington Hills, Michigan, which does make me a Detroit Tigers fan, but since we're not in the World Series, I'll be rooting for the Giants tomorrow. Again, I'm a web developer. I've been a web developer for almost 15 years now, and I love developing for the web. One thing that I find kind of unique about web development over other types of software development is that you have the potential to impact millions of people pretty easily and pretty quickly, and hopefully that impact is a positive impact. Three things that motivate me is, the first thing is that what I'm building adds value. I want to benefit people's lives in some way. The second thing is what I'm building is used by a lot of people. I mean, I get excited when even one person uses what I build, but the more and more people that use what I build, the more motivated I get to continue to do what I'm doing and to find better ways to do it. The last thing that really motivates me is making sure that what I build can be used by anybody. And unfortunately, people with disabilities run into the issue where you have a poor user experience for people that rely on assistive technologies. And that's why the W3C created the Web Accessibility Initiative. I think it was 1997 when they first started. And that was really just to make the web a more accessible place for everyone. And I like to think that most of what we build as web developers and designers should be pretty easily accessible with really little to no effort. It's really those wrong turns we make during development or design that gives us those accessibility issues. However, there are those times where what we want to build requires a more dynamic user experience. And that's not as trivial to make accessible. And that's why WAI-ARIA was formed. It's I believe the first draft was published in 2006, so it's not brand new. It's a framework that user agents and web developers and designers and assistive technologies have been following for quite some time. But just recently this year it became an official W3C recommendation. Before we talk about some specifics and the building blocks of ARIA and some examples, I really want to talk about HTML semantics first. I think that will help really surface some of the gaps that ARIA helps fill, as well as maybe when we shouldn't be using ARIA versus just plain old HTML. So here's an example of markup that is the complete opposite of semantic markup. Basically, it's using the div element as universal element and using classes to identify each instance of those elements. So things like header, title, intro, main, list. This is a sea of divs, and I'm sure at some point in time in our career we've contributed to a sea of divs or seen sea of divs. This is actually bad HTML, and that's not really an opinion-based statement. The W3C says this about the div. It has no special meaning at all. It's an element of last resort. Developers should actually use more appropriate elements, and that will lead to better accessibility for readers and more easily maintainable code for authors. Similarly with the span element really has no meaning at all. Now they're not saying don't use those elements, but they are saying that these elements don't provide structure to your document. They don't provide meaning. These are the type of elements that they really want you to be using. and I'm sure most of these, if not all of these, look really familiar. Let's take a look at a specific example. I like to call it anchor button. And for this talk, it's really not just the anchor element being used to implement a button. It's really any element that's not a button or an input type button to implement a button on the web. So some of you might be saying, well, who cares, right? I can use CSS to style all these elements to look like one another, to look like a button. I can use JavaScript so that they all behave like a button. Users shouldn't really care. So let's talk about each one of these elements and what they don't give you that a button element will give you out of the box. Now, assuming we're not using a submit button or reset button, we have to create some sort of function that we want to tie to these elements. But once that's all said and done, this is where sort of all the elements take separate paths. So keyboard navigation and functionality is a huge part of web accessibility. So the first part is navigation. So users are expected, and when you use a button element, are able to navigate to these elements. So most commonly using the tab key. Well, divs and spans won't give you this out of the box. You can easily achieve this by adding tab index attribute and setting the value to 0. We'll place it in the natural tab order. Pretty easy. Anchors, they won't be in the tab order if they don't have an href element or attribute. And if an href attribute is present, really the spec says it should behave like a hyperlink, but we can sort of stretch the definition of what a hyperlink is and still use the anchor as a button. The next thing is visible focus. So basically, once you're able to navigate to these elements, the users should be aware that they're actually focused on those elements. And with buttons that comes out of the box, most browsers will implement focus at more of like a wildcard and as their default CSS, but it's not implemented consistently across browsers. So if you're not going to use the button element, you probably want to make sure that you have a focus state specified in your CSS so that users will tell that they're focused on those elements. Enter in space. So the enter key in the space bar. Once you're able to navigate to these elements and that it's visually that it's obvious that you have navigated those elements, you must be able to interact with those elements. So buttons, when you click on the when you use the enter key or you use the space bar on a button element, it will trigger the same functionality that you tied to the click handler. Divs and spans will not give you that. They need both to consistently behave the same way in all browsers. And similar with an anchor, most browsers will trigger that functionality that you tie to the click handler using the enter key, but spacebar will not behave consistently across all browsers. So just to give you an idea, so some of you might think, well, you know, I looked at this in IE and Firefox, and I don't need to add enter key or spacebar functionality. It automatically happens. Well, in Windows and IE and Firefox it does. In Chrome it doesn't. And in Mac, Firefox, Chrome, and Safari, you need to make sure that you implement the enter key and spacebar functionality to trigger that functionality, just so it behaves consistently across browsers. And the last thing is assistive technology. So this is where we're going to start to get into ARIA a little bit. So assistive technology, like a screen reader, won't really identify a div as anything other than plain text. Now, some screen readers will differ. So below, some might just say I'm a button. Some might recognize, they might be smart enough to say, okay, you've got some functionality tied to this, and I'll say I'm a button clickable. But it won't be recognized as a button. Similarly with anchors, they'll be identified as a link. They won't be identified as plain text, but it won't be a button. And screen readers, some variations will say I'm a button internal link or link I'm a button. Whereas ultimately, you want people using assistive technologies to be able to tell that they're actually on a button. So just here's an example. If you use the button element, it will be identified as a button. And most screen readers are pretty consistent. Just an example, it says I'm a button. So most of you are probably pretty familiar with just in general how screen readers work, but one thing that we might not be so obvious to us is, you know, screen reader users just don't use the tab key to navigate through a web page or a web application. That could be pretty tedious. And especially if they're familiar with the website, they may not need to poke around and figure out how to use it. They may just want a list of all the headings, so navigate through a web page using heading structure. Might also want to see all the landmarks on a page, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another way as users using screen readers might navigate through a site is through getting a list of all the links. So this is a screenshot from VoiceOver, the built-in screen reader at the OS level for Mac. Here, our anchor button is listed under links, which could be a little confusing. And not under form controls, where we would expect to see all the buttons listed. So what now? How do we solve this issue where screen readers are not identifying this as a button. We can easily add some click handlers to this container. Here's just some jQuery example. We can add tab index 0, and we can make sure that when they use the enter key or the space bar, it will trigger that same functionality that we tied up at the top. But it's still going to be identified as a button. So what do? We can use ARIA. So we can use, one thing that ARIA has is called roles. So a valid role for ARIA is button. So if we just give this particular container a role of button, it will now be identified by screen reader and other assistive technologies as an actual button, which is great. This really is a Band-Aid. This is an ARIA Band-Aid. Really, if kind of go by the duck rule. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it really should be a duck with button, a heading, list. Use the proper semantic elements unless you don't have control over the markup, like if you're using a third-party API or library that really doesn't give you control over the markup, you can go ahead and use this Band-Aid. But really, it's a lot of work too, right? I mean, you have to do all of this. You have to make sure that the key press handling is achieved and that we add this ARIA role equals button, and we make sure it gets in the tab index, and we make sure that the CSS is properly applied to all these non-button elements. Whereas you could just be using the button element, and life would be a lot easier. So some other ARIA roles. Well, the purpose of the role is to really describe the type of widget being displayed or structural landmarks. So some other examples of widgets besides button, which is listed there, are tree item, toolbar, tab panel, and dialog. Some examples of landmarks are search, banner, navigation, main. And similarly, as we saw the list of links, screen readers might want to navigate through a site using the landmark. So on this particular website, there's a main menu navigation, there's a banner, there's a main portion of the page, and there's also secondary navigation, and at the very bottom there's some content information. Typically you'll have like copyright or other footer type elements that you'll associate with content information. So many HTML elements actually have inherent roles where you don't need to specify any type of ARIA role. So like anchors with links and buttons and headings, you don't need to do anything special. Those already have the inherent ARIA roles and associated properties. Whereas article, progress for progress bar, and nav for navigation don't quite yet have the full adoption. So you don't need to do something like this, where you have heading role or heading level 1, role equals heading, ARIA level equals 1, or button role equals button. Just use those elements. But you do need to do this still. Nav role equals navigation, or article role equals article. And I'm certain that this will eventually go away, where you don't even have to specify for nav and article those particular roles. But for now you do. It's not supported the same across all browsers and operating system combinations. ARIA attributes. So now that we can define certain widgets, we also want to make sure we can define or describe the widget and its state. So some example properties. So ARIA controls, or ARIA level, described by and labeled by. And some example states. So ARIA checked, expanded, hidden, disabled. And we'll see some examples here real shortly. So at the time that I created this presentation, I believe this is one of the most expensive televisions out there in the market. Price tag, $150,000. But this is something that you typically will see on any consumer website, where you'll have these different tabs down at the bottom where maybe not all this information is super critical for the user experience. So creating this tab-like widget is the best way to display it. So some markup might look like this, where you've got heading level 1, Samsung 110-inch 4K HDTV. You've got your list of tabs there at the top, and then you've got a section for each particular set of info. So I've got one section for product info, another section for technical specs, and then another section not shown here for additional information. A screen reader is just going to read this as Samsung 110-inch heading level 1, list with 3 items. Product info, list item, product info, heading 2. It's better than using divs, but it's still not a great user experience for people that rely on assistive technologies. So the first thing we can do is add roles. So there's a role of tab list, which will have a list of all your tabs. Role of tab for each individual tab, and then tab panel for each individual section of information. The next thing, which we haven't seen yet, are some examples of ARIA attributes. So each tab is going to control a particular tab panel. So here we've added both ARIA controls attribute for each tab at the top, and then we've created an ID for each section. So ID prod info and ID tech specs. The ARIA controls attribute will take the ID as its value of the particular tab panel that it's controlling. ARIA selected is a state type attribute, where when a user goes through each individual tab, that ARIA selected will change from either true to false depending on whether or not that's the currently selected tab. And then for each tab panel, the one for which information is currently being shown will have ARIA expanded true. Otherwise, you could have ARIA expanded false or not even list that particular attribute there. Similarly with ARIA hidden false and ARIA hidden true. And then ARIA labeled by. So we want to make sure we label each particular panel and we give it the ID of each tab shown at the top. So maybe some of you might be thinking ARIA rocks. Some of you might be thinking ARIA is still a little confusing. I don't get it. That's just a bunch of attributes. It does rock, but only if it's done right. So, oops. One great resource is this WAI-ARIA authoring practices. It's on the W3.org site. It will tell you for each particular widget what types of state level properties should be present when they need to change, the types of attributes that should also be present for all the widgets. And you need to test. So there's similar to just browsers and operating systems. There's a lot of variations in how each of these work and how they're supported. Like I said, just until recently did it become an official W3C recommendation. So you want to make sure not only are you testing it yourself with the various screenreaders, and a lot of them are free, so VoiceOver comes built in with OS X. There's ChromeVox, which is a browser-level screenreader, which you can just go to the Chrome App Store and you can use it in your browser. NVDA is a free one for Windows, and there's another very common one called JAWS, but that's not free, but you can get a trial version and use it a little bit. But you also want to test this with end users too. You know, the last thing you want to do is add all these attributes and states and widgets, and it still not be a great user experience. So let's look at another example, and we'll get into a little bit more of what also ARIA specifies. So I love guitars. I wish I could own hundreds and hundreds of guitars, but with two little boys, it's really hard to maintain that kind of lifestyle. So let's say I want to start off with a list. So I got a very short list of guitar brands: Fender, Gibson, Ibanez. Screenreader will read this pretty simply. It will tell you what the heading level is and how long the list is and each individual list item. And then my list starts to grow. So I want to break it down not just by brand, but the particular guitars that fall under that brand. And then I also want to break it down into category, electric and acoustic. And then I start going crazy and buy multiple guitars with every paycheck, and my list starts to grow pretty big. Now, of course, I can make this list look a lot better using CSS. But as we saw before, what doesn't seem so bad from a screenreader perspective could start to be pretty verbose. So not only do I want to change the user experience just for users without disabilities, I also want to change it for users with disabilities. So maybe I'll use a tree where I can expand and collapse. Maybe people aren't interested in what Gibson or Ibanez has and just wants to see Fender guitars. So they can expand and collapse each individual sub-list. So here's a kind of zoomed in example of the code. So now I want to add some ARIA attributes. So the most parent attribute here is going to be role tree, and each sub tree here is going to have the ARIA attribute of group, or ARIA attribute role for group, And then each list item under all of the trees are going to have a role of tree item. I'll add some more attributes, so indicate what level these tree items are under. So ARIA level equals 1, 2, and 3. Also indicate whether or not these are expanded. This ARIA expanded was also the same attribute that we saw on the tab panel example. Similar to what we've seen before, I want to add ARIA labeled by and give each particular sublist the ID of the particular heading that I want to label each list for. And the example we've seen so far is very similar to the tab list, except for one thing, which also applies to the tab panel, but managing focus. So also part of the authoring practices, you will see how to manage focus within the widget. So once you tab to a particular widget, whether it's a dialog or a tab panel or a tree, typically once you hit tab again, you are tabbing away from that particular widget. Usually if you want to navigate within that widget, you want to use other keys like arrow keys. So if we look at the authoring practices for the tree widget, we'll see all these expected ways that you should be able to navigate within a tree. So up an arrow will move between the visible nodes. Left arrow on an expanded node will close the node. Right arrow expands a closed node. There's a whole nother page of this. And these are all listed out in that authoring practices webpage on the W3C site. So now what we can do is, at the very top, you'll see ARIA active descendant, and it will have the ID of the currently active tree item. And as you navigate with your arrow keys through a tree, that ID will change. And so what we've added are two attributes now. One, ARIA selected for each particular tree item, and all of them will be false, except for the one that's actually selected. And then the ID for each tree item, which can be used at the very top for that ARIA active descendant. Last couple things I want to touch on, since we're running short on time. Less classes. So why are less classes a good thing? So W3C says something interesting about classes. So authors could conceivably design their own document language based on elements with almost no associated presentation. So basically, instead of having using ARIA role tree item and ARIA role group and ARIA role tree, I could just have classes for those. I could have class equals tree, class equals subtree, class equals tree item, or whatever I decide to. But that's not very portable because those classes really just mean something within your context of development. They really make no sense anywhere else. So the nice thing about ARIA is that it provides a way for everyone to implement these particular widgets the same way. And this is just an example of a less snippet, but you could do this in regular old CSS, not a big deal. You can use these attributes in your style sheet. Something that becomes very portable. Similarly, I can use these selectors as well in my JavaScript. So what have we learned? We learned we want to start with the basics. So we don't want to do things like this if we really don't have to. So span role button or div role equals heading, ARIA level equals 1. Just use the elements that the HTML spec provides you, button and h1, or input type button if it belongs to a form. And ARIA is not magic. So just adding these attributes to your elements, your markup, doesn't just automatically make your markup behave like the widgets you intend them to. There's definitely JavaScript involved. There's definitely making sure you're adding them correctly. There's some CSS involved sometimes. So you have to make sure to read those authoring practices to make sure you're doing things correctly. It needs to be tested. So one thing you also want to make sure you're not doing is not reinventing the wheel. So you could play around with, how does ARIA work with dialogues? But there's thousands of dialogue implementations already out there that use ARIA. So for example, jQuery UI, they happen to implement ARIA pretty well on all of their widgets. So I would recommend going and checking that out and playing around with it in various screen readers. But you also want to make sure you test with actual people. Because while this isn't old, the recently became a recommendation. So not all browsers and assistive technologies and combinations of operating systems are all going to be behaving the same. So you want to make sure you test this with actual people if you have the benefit and ability to do so. And ARIA is awesome, but again, it needs awesome developers to make sure that they're doing the right thing and that they're following the authoring practices, they're following the spec, they're doing the testing, and not reinventing the wheel. So does anyone have any questions? Yes? Yes, I can put it online. Yep. I will send out either info on HTML5 DevConf, Google Plus, or Twitter. I'll just put that out there. Yes?
You have some things like the depth on the tree.
Yes.
Now that's maintained manually by the developer. If you have a tool, if you have to say the list, and there's an area thing for the ordinal position of the list, you remove an element. Do you have to renumber the others, or is it? I'm just wondering how much of the area roles and things like that could actually be automated to a degree, like a list is a known structure.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you want to come up with as convenient as a way to implement these as possible. So as opposed to just hard coding as a markup or things like that, I mean, you could write JavaScript to lay on top of a particular current already built HTML widget, I guess you could call it, and apply all these attributes, look at how deep are these lists, and add the appropriate level.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to think is to take a simple example of a list.
Yeah.
Let's say there's an ARIA tag for the ordinal position of the list.
Mm-hmm.
You click an operation that removes the second element.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a specific example, but since you're really just sort of hypothetically speaking, yeah, it would definitely be up to the developer to maintain that.
Is there any idea that they might want to try and... Well, I'm wondering if some of the ARIA tags or roles could be automated a bit. In other words, you know, the browser will tag things to a degree.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. So the current version that's published is 1.0. 1.1 is still in the works. It doesn't seem like there's going to be anything earth-shattering in 1.1, but it will really be interesting to see what the ARIA spec for 2.0 has in store.
Okay, because it was just...
Well, and that kind of goes back to the slide of, but that was really more around ARIA roles. See if I can get to it quickly here.
Well, I mean, some of the tags we put are going to be specific to your application and really a browser can guess. But I'm thinking stuff like ordering positioning or depth of the tree could be something that a browser could tag for you.
It might get to that point. Like I said, especially, I mean, this is a lot simpler than what you're talking about. This is really specific to roles. As I mentioned before, like I imagine there'll be a point where you don't have to add role equals navigation to the nav element. You don't have to add role equals article to the article element. As HTML5 evolves and as ARIA spec evolves, this is something that hopefully will get better and better. But it's definitely not trivial, and you have to make sure that you look at the authoring practices, make sure you're doing the right thing, because just adding these attributes and not painting the full picture and not providing the attributes completely in the way that they're expected could just not add any value at all.
Well, I'm just a bit scared that, you know, you get everything ready.
Yeah.
Someone works on the next release while you're doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a lot of ARIA tags and roles that have to be explicitly updated, that's something that could break, you know, silent. And suddenly, you know, someone's using a screen reader.
Sure.
And you're getting contradictory information.
Sure, and it's, yeah, I mean, definitely if you're building something homegrown, I would recommend, depending on how you're doing it. Now, if you're using JavaScript to sort of overlay and add these attributes dynamically, you probably, I don't know if you test drive your JavaScript, but that would be one way to do it. You know, test drive your JavaScript to make sure that given the current markup, I'm going to add these particular attributes in this way. But in general, automated testing for this kind of thing isn't super easy.
Yeah, I can appreciate that.
And this may also be a good point to add. If that is a concern, maybe add accessibility as part of your QA process.
Oh, absolutely. You know, sometimes, a lot of times, unfortunately, well, you can get development teams more familiar with the various tools like screen readers, which is great. But ultimately, you want to have users that use those particular tools on a daily basis because they rely on them. And unfortunately, a lot of companies don't have that. But it's really worth pointing out. In the company I work at, we don't really have anyone coming in on a normal basis testing our things. But we do have someone come in maybe every few months, or at least 3 times a year, to just talk in general about how she uses screen readers from different sites and how things have changed and either gotten better or gotten worse. But it's still nowhere near where we'd like it to be, but it's definitely better than nothing when you have developers that are familiar with how to use these tools and look for these types of things. Yeah.
Website when it comes to accessible, and just give you some context or just start like says the validating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything like that? And the second question is like, how do you, when you're doing this kind of work, do you build these attributes and just add them on just after the markup? So do you do this like a build step or something?
Well, any of the work that I've done, a lot of times have been giving the ability for people, for developers, to add this kind of thing to legacy sites. So, you know, as opposed to them going into the markup, create JavaScript tools to add this. So I can totally test drive those tools, right? I can totally test drive that I'm adding the right attributes and the right, as state changes, changing those state level properties correctly. But as far as tools go, so, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with like the WebAIM developer toolbar, or even Google has some accessibility tools built into Chrome. They will identify that you are using ARIA, but as far as I know, they don't really look at the full picture. So they don't say, oh, you're using an ARIA tree. So I want to make sure now that you've got things within that ARIA tree, like group and tree item, and that when you change the states, that those states change appropriately. I don't think that there's anything out there. At least not that I'm aware of. Yeah?
Does the HTML5 validator flag for accessibility?
When you say flag, do you mean, does it fail?
Match if there is an ad tag that doesn't have the rollout.
Oh, no, I don't think so. Right. Yeah, now that it's officially become a W3C recommendation, you might see some different types of validators. I don't know if it would actually be part of the HTML5 validator though, because like you said, it's not part of the spec, even though it's a W3C recommendation. I'm not even sure if it would make sense to be part of an HTML validator, but I'm sure there'll be more and more validators surfacing that will sort of blend the two together.
Yeah, a lot of people start complaining out of here about accessibility not validated, it's failing now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, my point too earlier is, you know, a lot of times too, I mean, these are a lot more simple examples, but with like button, you know, a lot of times I'll see design specs come in where they're using an anchor or a div. It's like, that's creating a lot more work for me if we want to keep that markup that way. Let's just use these elements like button, and you don't have to do all these additional things. But when you do get into the widgets, it becomes more complicated, and it does create extra work for developers. But then again, there are other third-party libraries and APIs that are out there, like I mentioned jQuery UI, for example, that do a pretty good job of implementing all this. So why as a developer, create your own dialogue where you can already go out and get a dialogue style, how you want it to look and behave how you want it to behave, and it already has a lot of stuff baked into it.
Are the popular screen readers more or less following the ARIA spec, or is it uneven? I've only basically played with one on Linux, and I played with JAWS, and
yeah.
as a sighted person using JAWS for the first time, it sounded like an auctioneer.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's getting better, and it will get better, especially now that it's an official recommendation. I mean, it sort of makes the problem even worse that we already have as developers and designers with just combinations of operating systems and browsers. Now we add this third thing to the mix, assistive technologies, which all behave differently on all those combinations. So you usually have like these target combinations. So with VoiceOver, obviously it only works on a Mac, but its sweet spot is with Safari. NVDA works on Windows. Its sweet spot is with Firefox. So you really want to get to understand how people that rely on these technologies, how they use them most commonly, before you start trying, this doesn't work great with VoiceOver and Chrome. That's probably not a combination that's used a ton. Similar with NVDA and Internet Explorer. A lot of people that use Internet Explorer use JAWS as their screen reader. So you just really want to make sure that before you start worrying about how is this going to consistently work across the board with all these different technologies, make sure that you know what those combinations are, so you can minimize at least the amount that you sweat. But it's getting better. But definitely something you have to test. Like I've created a few things now where I've done a lot of research and figuring out, what people are using, testing it on a lot of different versions, and you can't get it just right. But you want to make sure that it's, poor experience for someone using a screen reader is something that's super verbose or doesn't really make sense reading aloud. So those are the types of things you want to look for. Verbosity is a huge thing. Yeah. Yeah.
ARIA seems to be aimed at screen readers. How about stuff for like low vision? I mean, we've been studying it a bit at work because it's become a mandate for our product.
Yeah.
And stuff like contrast. He was saying that 90% of blind people can see something.
Yeah. Well,
so I mean, ARIA can still be a help to them, but I'm wondering, like, is the WAI also looking at stuff like contrast ratios?
Oh, absolutely, and those are already defined depending on what you need to follow. So, like, there's the WCAG guidelines, WCAG, which are very specific as what type of contrast ratio you need, and there's tools to easily test that.
I had a brutal week last week with the guys with Oracle, all going through all the standards they want to agree on. So I was curious. Just to be nice with the ARIA, it's just, I mean, some of the roles, like you said, some are implicit, some are not.
Yeah.
But some of the structural elements, like a depth in a list or a depth in a tree.
Yeah.
That. It sort of says it could be automated. It could be implicit. It could be,
Yeah, I mean, it'll definitely be interesting to see now that it's an official recommendation, how HTML5 starts to change and adopt some more of this type of stuff.
Yeah. The final thing is then you get the fun of people not updating their alt tags, and then who cares if the image is screwed up?
But you also, ARIA does seem very centered around screen reader users, but even just with the slide showing all the expected ways to navigate through using the keyboard, that's very keyboard centric. I mean, yeah, people that use screen readers rely on keyboard, but I kind of also look at it as a way to just say, in general, anyone implementing a tree, this is how keyboard should work when you navigate through this. I used to work for an insurance company where we were switching from mainframe screens to web-based screens. One of their number one requirements was I should be able to completely use this with a keyboard. They didn't want to touch a mouse because they figured out it's going to take me that much longer to enter a claim if I have to touch a mouse.
Well, one of the things that came up in the presentations we saw was, oh, great, it's tabbable, but I've got 200 links on this page, and so it became now groupings, you know, so you could actually, you know, you don't want the guy looking like he's sending Morse code just so he can do his work.
No, absolutely.
I don't know. It's an interesting topic, but well, one of the things that, you know, a few people were asking about validators. One of the things the guy said is, we don't even try, because people will use that as their baseline to say they can do it, and it's virtually impossible to automate. So, well, their view was you couldn't do a complete, you know, accessibility picture with an automated tool, so they didn't want people to lean on that, because then they would start checking boxes and saying we're
automating is tough for some things, but like I mentioned before, some of the things that I built really apply all this stuff using JavaScript, which you can easily test drive. So basically, you test the outcome in various screen readers to make sure that it's what you want, it's what people expect it to be and can use. But then you test drive your code that applies all those roles
I mean, if you got
and those
something that's setting the depths on trees, you can do that in isolation.
Yep,
and
exactly.
Just read it back.
Yep. So then if someone changes the code, then it will break during the
fair enough.
during the continuous integration.
Thanks.
Yep. Yeah.
I just wanted to double check what I thought I heard you say
Sure.
about the common combination